That's the one.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our training session today on MTRS membership eligibility and onboarding and registration and enrollment. So first, on behalf of our board and our executive director, thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to this show. We are going to be going through several topics with relation to MTRS membership eligibility, the process of setting up your brand new employees. So hopefully you'll find this helpful. Now, this is a part of a series of trainings. And what you'll see here is we're on the second session here. Now, some folks might be watching this from our website. We'll be posting these online. So if you're watching this from the website, I also tried to highlight which one we're on. So we're on training number 2 here. And for those of you who didn't attend last week, you might find some helpful information there. It's more than just an introduction to the MTRS. We cover some topics that sort of don't fit into the rest of the trainings. So you might want to peruse that or check it out. But we're on today's topic is going to be membership eligibility. So this one's kind of a deep in the weeds one. So we wanted to make sure we gave it its own program and then sort of just the byproducts of it, registering, enrolling your employees. So let's jump right in and we'll go from here. So first, as mentioned in last week's training session, so the MTRS is a state agency and we've been set up by one of the statutes, Mass General Law Chapter 32. So the pension plan itself is set up under Mass General Law Chapter 32, and you're going to see that eligibility really centers around that. So the definition of a teacher, the MTRS is set up in Chapter 32. The definition of a teacher really comes from Chapter 32. You're going to see there are some other statutes that play a part here, though. Chapter 71, the DESE law creates both charter schools and virtual schools, and there are some other statutory language in other parts of the statutes that create some of the other schools that contribute here. So aside from towns, we also have regional school districts. We have regional tech school districts, the Mass Science Academy, Quincy College. All of those entities are eligible specifically through different statutory language. And then sort of even though the statutes provide an overview as a state agency, the MTRS has also established a membership eligibility regulation to try and get more specific on some positions and try to provide more clarity for eligibility. So we're going to go through it in that order. Try to think of it as sort of the order in which things are eligible. So first, we're going to talk about Mass General Law, Chapter 32, Section 1. And that's the definition of a teacher. So in the definition of a teacher, as well as some of the other definitions that are in Section 1 of Chapter 32, there are some things that are established that are pretty important to understand. So first, there's a requirement that the employee be regularly employed. So they can't be somebody who's haphazardly employed or, they're day by day or sort of have no regular sort of relationship with the employer. It does not require they have the same hours. It does not require a specific shift. And you'll see that Chapter 32 covers not only teachers, but all the local retirement systems. So some of the language isn't going to be very specific school language. It's going to be regarding the eligible employees in the public retirement system. So it's all of the retirement boards. Now, to be eligible for the MTRS specifically, you do have to be employed by a public school or a school system. So again, that's going to be also very important. For instance, I had a call from a school and they were like, oh, we're thinking about moving our school nurses over to the health department. I said, okay, but you have to understand that they're no longer going to be eligible for the MTRS because they're not employed by the school department. So they changed that plan. But so it's a very important thing for folks to understand. Being an employee of the school district and being a public employee, of course, is going to be crucial to being an eligible member of the public retirement system. So to be considered for membership for the MTRS, you also have to be employed on a basis of not less than half-time service. So it can't be a situation, well, I mean, you're normally like, you have somebody who's like a 0.3 and they kind of become, half-time for like a week or two, or they do some extra hours and they just happen to creep over that line. They have to be employed at a basis of not less than half-time. Again, exactly what half-time is, we're going to go to the employer and figure out what the scale for full-time is. A lot of school employees or the full-time service is set at either 30 or 35 hours. So we're going to set the scale for halftime being half of that. So, there's no 20-hour minimum like some of the other local boards may have established, which, in a lot of cases doesn't make sense because their full-time employees aren't 40 hours. But for teachers, it's specifically half-time. Now, to meet this half-time eligibility, you'll see a paragraph at the bottom of the slide. Oh, and I apologize for not saying this sooner. If anybody would like to download a PDF to go through the slideshow, I meant to mention that we provided a link in the chat for this program. So if you go to the chat function, there's a link and you can download a PDF version of all these slides with a little section where you can take notes. I apologize, I forgot to mention that on when we started the program. So, but at the bottom of the slide, you're going to see a couple of examples. And what we're doing here is when somebody is compiling the halftime requirement, it is possible to be working in an employment situation where you're being shared by a couple of employers. Regional school districts do this a lot. We have a fair number of superintendents that might cover, say, 3 districts, right? So in no district are they half-time, but they're full-time between the 3. And so that's going to be okay. And it's not just for superintendents or administrators. We have a second example here where we have somebody who's a 40% teacher in one school district and a completely unrelated other public school district, they work 20%. This sometimes happens with music teachers, art teachers, or some other specialized things, maybe a specific kind of SPED teacher. They can be in completely unrelated towns. If they're doing 40% one and 20% in the other, or 40 and 40, we have one that's 50 and 60 because of the way the hours work. Somehow they end up working more hours than people generally do when they're full-time. That's okay. And because between the two, they're required to be licensed in both, and the two will help them meet that halftime threshold. So that's those sorts of situations are absolutely acceptable. Those ones are kind of few and far between, but I like to draw that example because we get the superintendent question a lot when folks are new. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm stalling a little bit just to give folks time to download if they wanted to. Now, on the next section, we're going to talk about something else that's in Chapter 32, Section 1, and that's that in the definition of teacher, it very specifically breaks out some position descriptions. And so it's going to include the school psychologist, the school psychiatrist, adjustment counselor, social worker, director of occupational guidance and placement, principals, superintendents, supervisors. Now, when somebody's a supervisor, they do have to be a supervisor of teacher to be eligible, but teacher or supervisor or teacher of adult civic education, which is something I don't think we have a whole lot of these days. Please keep in mind that the statute was written in 1914. And assistant principals and assistant superintendents are also eligible very specifically because they meet these criteria. Now, these job titles are very important when we're doing an evaluation by title. So let's say, for instance, I had a conversation with a school district recently, and they were trying to tell me that their human resources director, well, they're the same thing as an assistant superintendent. Well, no, they're not, because they're a human resources director and they're not the assistant superintendent. So if the intention is to make them the assistant superintendent, and that would be what makes them eligible by title, well, they have to have the title, right? So short of that, you can't claim someone's eligible by title. Now, if a director of HR also is required to be DESE licensed, which we'll get into with the regulation, that might be fine too. But in this particular conversation, they were trying to say that they were eligible by title. So to be eligible by title, you have to have the title. Now, when it comes to the folks who are eligible by title, they don't somehow supersede the other things we just talked about. So they are still required to be regularly employed. They have to work for the school department, and it has to be on a basis of not less than half-time. But because this is in the statute, they cannot be excluded for licensure reasoning. So we're going to talk about our eligibility reg in just a moment, but they cannot be excluded based on the fact whether or not a licensure is applying to them, okay, because they're eligible by title. Now, DESE probably requires licensure for a lot of these positions anyway, so it becomes kind of, moot. Now, for members who are not eligible by position, the first thing I want to say is nobody's ever disqualified by position. Sometimes we might jump the gun and say, oh, yeah, that position's probably not eligible, but we should be saying probably, right? Because nobody is ever disqualified by position. The traits of that position commonly might not require them, or may make them ineligible. right? They may not meet the requirements for membership, and that might be why we're quick to say, oh, this position's probably not eligible. But again, probably should always be there because it's really about the facts and whether or not the positions meet the requirements. So in addition to, so for folks who are not eligible by title, okay, we have a membership regulation that we're going to go through in detail. And think of this as being the clarification piece, because while the statute is pretty clear on a bunch of titles, there are a whole bunch of people who work in a school department that are not listed or disqualified based on that list, right? So the board adopted a regulation to sort of clarify who exactly is a teacher. And what you'll see, the principle or the guiding principle for our membership eligibility regulation is that DESE's telling us who a teacher is, right? So we're going to base it on licensure. And it's going to be in the full control of DESE and who's a teacher. It's not the MTRS's sort of role in life, if you will, to tell folks who a teacher is. That comes from DESE. What we do is we follow their lead. Now, some of the positions that are not mentioned by title, I just like to bring these up because we get these questions all the time. Like, oh, yeah, well, I heard BCBAs are eligible, or athletic directors, ROTC instructors, long-term subs, and nurses. So these positions can all be eligible if they meet the 4 eligibility criteria. Now, I can tell you currently, ROTC instructors are almost impossible to be eligible because the federal government doesn't let you place any requirements on there who they place in as ROTC instructors. So we're not looking to exclude them, but because of the way the law works, they tend to be excluded. Now, it doesn't mean that they'll always be. And if they meet the 4 criteria we're going to talk about, it's possible that they could be there if you're allowed to place those requirements on them. So this sort of brings us to our membership. Oh, and before we get into the membership eligibility regulation, I should really ask, do we have anything in the chat that we'd like to discuss? Is there anything you want me to say out loud?
We do have one.
Okay.
The question is, do we need to get proof of other district employment?
Do you need to get proof of other district employment? That's a great question. It wouldn't hurt. Or you can always ask your MTRS rep. The issue with asking us, though, is let's say somebody is less than half-time in each of the 2 employers. We might not know about them yet, right? Because both of the 2 employers are going to not know if they should register the person, that sort of thing. So you can always ask us if need to. But I imagine if they work at the other school district, they should be able to get their contact info. So it would be good to be able to just verify that they're definitely in both places. It might be possible for us to do it, but in some cases it might not be. Again, if they were half-time in each or less than half-time in each, in theory, that person would be completely off of our radar. Any others? No. Cool. All right. Awesome. So let's talk about the membership eligibility regulation. So first, let me make sure that everyone's aware that in April of 2022, there was a major update to the eligibility regulation. So we're going to talk about some of the things that changed in the membership eligibility regulation, and we're going to talk about some of the things that haven't changed at all. Okay. So many of the aspects and the fundamental structure of it, I don't think it's changed a whole lot, but we've added some things to it to clarify, and there was a court case that was important that we clarified. So we're hoping this provides pretty good guidance overall and covers all the scenarios we can think of. And so we have, in addition to the 4 eligibility criteria, there's a section of definitions, and then there are a couple of sections to sort of just more clearly define or specify that we know certain parties are eligible. So we're going to go through each part of that here. Now, the first thing that I know we just went through, that this is the statute and these are the positions that are eligible according to the statute. I just wanted to bring this back up. This change to the membership eligibility reg it makes absolutely no changes to how this affects membership eligibility. So all those things that are statutory are more powerful than our regulation, and therefore none of them have changed at all. So I just want to make sure I point that out. Now, we did make a couple of small changes, wording changes, that sort of thing. We refer to DESE as DESE now instead of Department of Ed, things like that, in the 4 eligibility criteria. So with the 4 eligibility criteria, I know it may feel a little backwards, but I always like to work from the bottom up. So I think the most important one, or the easiest one to clarify for positions that you're really checking this, right? So if you have a science teacher, they teach physics in high school, right? They're kind of a slam dunk MTRS member, right? If they're full-time, because you know that the DESE is going to require you to have their licensure. They've got their licensure. They're a classroom teacher. There's not really a lot of people asking questions about those. So let's start with the fourth criteria, which is D. So the contractual agreement with the employee requires that they be DESE licensed as a condition of employment. So this is not, well, I mean, it'd be great if you were certified, or, well, we'd prefer you to be certified. This is, look, if you're going to have the job, you have to have a license. Now, there can be situations, and we're going to clarify those in the next slide. So we're going to talk about some additional criteria around that. But really, that should be the first question you ask, right? Okay, does this position require licensure as a condition of employment? Now, this is for positions that are not eligible by title, right? So if they're eligible by title, you don't have to go through this. They're eligible by title, they meet the first couple criteria that we mentioned, boom, they're in. You don't have to go through this evaluation. So this is for positions that aren't eligible by title, and the first thing you want to really nail down is whether or not that position is required to have licensure as a condition of employment. So in the second one, does the contractual agreement require they be not less than half-time? Well, that should sound familiar. Our eligibility regulation repeats what the statute already tells you to do. The third one, is the individual covered by a contractual agreement for employment with one or more school committees or school boards? So again, they have to be in the school department. Should sound awfully familiar, exactly what the statute tells us we're supposed to do. And then A, individual holds a license granted by DESE. Well, I mean, A and D kind of go together. We boxed it in very nicely. If they're required to have a license, well, they must have a license, right? And I know there are some exceptions to that. We're going to get to that in the next slide. So, but this is the 4 eligibility criteria. So again, they're required to have a DESE license. They have a DESE license. They're not less than half-time, and they're working for the school or school department, public employee. Not too hard, right? It always seems so simple. So a couple of additional criteria information, a little bit of clarification around here, right? So licensure must be required as a condition of employment. It cannot be preferred, and the person must possess the license that's required. Now, the MTRS is not the license police, right? So if you're telling me that you can employ a classroom teacher in a middle school that, you know, for a person that only has a high school licensure, if DESE allows for that, sure. You know, that's not our place. However, if you're telling, oh yeah, license is required, but they've been employed here for 6 years without having a license, we're gonna have questions, right? How's that possible? It doesn't, you know, it doesn't sound like it's something that's allowed by DESE, right? Now, if the employee has been granted a waiver, so you know, there have been some pretty famous waivers. You know, I think Bill Gates once taught classes. I know that Steve Jobs has. And so if Steve Jobs, while he was still with us, wanted to teach a computer class, well, the guy who founded Apple, yeah, okay, we'll let him teach a computer class, right? That makes sense. I'm pretty sure DESE would be pretty okay with that. So you could have other situations where somebody is extraordinarily qualified, but they're not a teacher, and they'll give a waiver to them. Okay, great. DESE tells us who a teacher is. If they've granted a waiver, that waiver is treated just like being licensed by the MTRS. They are immediately eligible. Now, let's say there are folks who are pending licensure. They're in the middle of one of DESE's multiple pathways to becoming a licensed teacher. Okay, that person will qualify immediately as long as they meet the other criteria, of course. But as far as licensure, that's good to go. They're going through the process. They're pending their licensure. They're going through one of DESE's pathways to becoming a full licensed teacher. DESE tells us who a teacher is, right? So for the purpose of eligibility, the written contract does not have to be written contract. So this is a common question we get. Sometimes we can have a school district and they're like, well, I mean, I'm wondering if none of our teachers are eligible because we're not a union district. We don't have a collective bargaining agreement. We don't have contracts for employees. We give them, you know, maybe an appointment letter or something along those lines. So there's I'm not gonna word this well, but our lawyers have very well explained this to us in the past, that there's sort of an unwritten agreement, and it's an expectation. It's an expectation of everyone who works here at the MTRS that you're going to show up, you're going to work hard, and then you're going to earn benefits. You've been hired, you get some kind of written confirmation that you're an employee, and they call that the employment contract, right? It's the understood contract between employers and employees that they're going to pay you for your service and you're going to provide said service. And so for the purposes of membership eligibility, that is going to be good enough. So if you have somebody who has an employment agreement, then other things, you know, a written employment agreement, then other things are going to have to be included for when it comes to regular compensation. Little promo for a training we're going to do on a different day. But for the purpose of eligibility, even if there's not a written contract, it's still considered contractual based on the fact that the person's employed. Hopefully that makes sense. So in addition to those 4 eligibility criteria, there are a couple of sort of, I'm going to call them side notes, other things that are addressed in the eligibility criteria section of the regulation. So the first one, folks who are employed in not less than a half-time basis as the director of an EdCo lab. This should not be a surprise to anybody. It's just that it wasn't specifically written in the statute, and so we wanted to make sure we added it in. We accept them as superintendents, and so they more formally added it to the regulation in 2022. So folks who are working in a Massachusetts public charter school, an innovation school, or Quincy College, right? So again, just to address them a little more clearly in our regulation, these were all added, but they were all already acknowledged as members of the MTRS. This is more about formalizing it. And for these entities, of course, we list the other criteria below. It's just more so to be very clear or legally clearer on exactly how and why they're accepted. And then last but not least, we also have something in the regulation to address separation of service. And so, for example, if you have somebody who is working as in a position, they're deemed to be MTRS eligible, and now they drop below a certain criteria, right? There was a very important and sort of prominent court case called Stoneham v. Crabb. And with that, we felt that there was a need to put something in the regulation just to be very clear what the expectations are around separation of service. So for those who are an MTRS member, they remain an MTRS member unless there's a qualified separation of service. And we're going to talk about the definitions in just a moment. And really, this plugs into that very well. So in the membership regulation, for the first time, we also have definitions. Now, one of the definitions is going to be separation of service. We're going to get to that one in a moment. I don't want to leave that as what seemed to be an unanswered question. We will get there, but there's a couple of other ones we want to just address first. So the first one's a teacher position. So a teacher position is basically defining that it has to be at least half-time basis, something that satisfies MTRS eligibility criteria, but you'll see teacher position otherwise referenced in the regulation. So we're defining exactly what we expect or mean by that. Same thing with day-to-day employment. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this training, in the statute, it's very clear that you need to be regularly employed. So if somebody finds themselves in a situation where they are working and they're full-time and now they're going to drop down to a status of maybe a consultant, something that's off and on or day by day, there's no clear expectation of some sort of an FTE, that's what we refer to as day-to-day employment. Now, sometimes it can be paid hourly, sometimes it can be grouped in some sort of payment or something, but the idea here is, do they have a regular expectation of when they should be at work? The next one's short-term employment. So short-term employment is temporary or part-time employment that's less than 6 months. So short-term employment would be, you have somebody, maybe they were already working for the school department and they're going to cover somebody who's a teacher and they're only going to be working 8 weeks, or they're only going to be working 10 weeks, something like that. If it's less than 6 months, then we're going to consider that short-term employment. And that very small shift to being what some people would call a teacher, we don't feel is definitive enough to define them or to qualify them for the teacher's retirement system. Now, if that short-term employment extends, we're going to talk about that a little bit longer, a little bit in more detail on a section on long-term subs. But while they're in this pocket, this expectation of only working for a very short period of time, they're not going to jump into eligibility for the MTRS. It's a very temporary situation. Next, we have separation of service. So this is the part that I was talking to, sort of rolling into the definitions. So under separation of service, this is a concept that's very important, because we talk a lot about when a member first becomes eligible, and then that member stays eligible, even if they switch employers. They do have to repetition if they change employers or re-enroll, but they're an eligible member, right? And every time they switch employers, every time they quit a job, this needs to be reevaluated. So we wanted to make sure we gave a very clear and list out exactly what a break in service is. So separation of service includes resigning from the employer, their failure to be reelected if they're somehow an electionary position, removal or discharge from the position, so somebody who gets laid off or fired. Their commencement of service is that of other than a teacher position. So again, this is where teacher position for the previous definitions makes sense. So if you have somebody who's going from an MTRS eligible position and now they're going to electionarily take a job or they get appointed to a job that just wouldn't qualify on its own. One of the recent examples I can think of is we had a classroom teacher who became the director of transportation at a school district, and the director of transportation position did not require licensure. So because they're taking that job or they're being appointed into that job, they would then move to the local retirement board. So that's a good example of sort of that situation. Much like we would accept brand new teachers who used to be a teacher's aide, and we'll talk a little bit about that as this program goes on as well. Now, their commencement of a day-to-day or short-term employment. So this would be somebody who is leaving a full-time teacher gig, and maybe they're sliding towards retirement, or they had some sort of a life situation where they're going to take a consultant role, or they're going to take some sort of a day-by-day coverage sort of thing. Maybe they have a family situation where they can cover sometimes, but they can't really work regularly. And again, regular employment becomes an issue here. And so with that, we're going to say that that's considered a break in service. Yes. So the question is, can the employee be placed with the MTRS if they've applied for an emergency license, but they've not yet been approved? Or a waiver. So I guess my question is, can you legally employ somebody who's not yet approved by DESE to be a teacher? And I think if you can get that answer from DESE, it answers your MTRS question. So DESE tells us who a teacher is. So in theory, you can't employ them as a teacher unless you have some sort of an indication from DESE that one of those two things are going to be granted. So I think that's why there's a little bit of a void of specificity in our law, because again, we're designed to follow DESE's lead. So I think it's more of a question for DESE. Can you hire somebody who's in that situation? And if they are saying, yes, you can hire them because they're going to get their emergency licensure, or if they give you criteria that they're going to be a slam dunk for an emergency licensure, then MTRS is going to accept them in kind because DESE tells us who a teacher is. Hopefully that helps. Are there any others? Okay, cool. So going back to the definitions, we talked about some of the things that disqualify people, and please, don't hesitate to ask questions if you have them. The beginning of any period in which an authorized leave of absence goes beyond a year. So if you have somebody who's going on an authorized leave, sometimes this is a little tricky because they might go on leave and it's going to be less than a year. And then real life happens. Let's say that it's because they're having kids or whatever the situation is. Maybe it's a family medical situation. And then it extends beyond a year, right? So it would be retroactive to when that leave started, right? If the leave's going to be greater than a year. The important thing here, though, is that there is an exception to them not severing employment, and that's if it's due to a medical situation, right? So let's say, for instance, you have somebody who is suffering an illness, and because they're on an extended leave of absence because it's medical leave. Now the MTRS need not know their exact diagnosis, that sort of thing. But if we know that they're out on leave of absence and it's for medical purposes, now we may ask the member to prove it's for medical purposes if it becomes legally pertinent later. But know that that's an important distinction, particularly when you're putting them in MTRS, because we will not, that the system does not kick them out if they're out for medical purposes. The other thing that we're going to mention here, and I'm going to mention it in another slide later as well, if they're on that leave of absence to serve as a full-time union representative. So if they're representing an employee organization and they're going to be a full-time member, they can actually continue membership while they're a full-time union rep. So If that's the situation, it's really a different kind of situation. And they can continue to make contributions to the MTRS and maintain their membership while they're representing their fellow employees. There aren't too many school districts that are big enough to have a full-time union representative. And it's clear, and something to be clear about too is it has to be for full-time. That's what the statute says. So there's a statutory reference, Chapter 32, Section 28K. And again, I'm going to mention that in essentially the next slide. Now, for the purpose of determining whether or not there's been a separation of service, we also want to mention the summer is not a break in service, nor are the weekends, right? So if you have somebody and they're going to switch positions, they're going from full-time to part-time, and you're like, oh, geez, but they had a break in service because they went from full-time in June, now they're going to be part-time in September. No. They don't work in July and August. It's like one long weekend. Hopefully it feels like one long weekend. But the fact that they weren't working for those 2 months doesn't somehow get held against them, okay? It will be important that there's a clarity to their position and that they're regularly employed when they come back, right? So they can't come back as a day-by-day sub. They do have to come back in a regularly employed situation. But the fact that over that break, you can't lose membership during that break. Now, occasionally, you might even run into a situation where you're expecting to do some layoffs. And it's the summertime and you're expecting to lay off 6 employees. Reach out to them and say, I'm sorry, we just don't have a position for you because of our budget situation. Then a couple of extra people retire that you weren't expecting. And you call one of those people back and you say, oh my God, great news. We don't have to lay you off. We're gonna be able to bring you back. Okay, so this happens over the summer. They never miss a day of work. That's very important. So if they've never missed a day of work, they have not been laid off. Okay, it happened over the summer. There was no work happening anyway. And if you've terminated them in the system, if you were great about adding it in, let your employer services rep know. We'll lift the termination. That's okay. So the summer really doesn't get held against the teacher. Okay, so I want to make sure that part's clear. We're not looking to treat that as a break in service of any way, shape, or form. Hopefully that's clear. Yes.
Teacher who takes a before the school year, shared position with another teacher.
Okay, so question is, you have somebody who goes on a leave, they come back, it's childbearing leave. Now, we're going to say that they remained eligible for this leave. We're going to presume this for the question. So they either remained eligible because it was medical and it went over a year, but it was medical, or it was less than a year while they're doing childbearing leave, because childbearing leaves can turn medical. But let's say it was a non-medical childbearing leave and it's less than a year. Okay, so that's going to be important to this answer. Then they come back and they're less than half-time. Well, they're still a member in service, right? So they're not getting reevaluated for the 4 eligibility criteria. They are going to remain eligible because they are still regularly employed when they come back at 40%. Now, if that same person comes back and they're like, well, they're going to day-by-day sub for us, we can probably, we'll probably get her in here 2 days a week. That's not the same thing. They're not regularly employed. So the regular employment is going to be key, and the fact that they did not sever membership in between would also be key. But yes, they would be eligible. So yes. So 2 things. One, we would need a leave of absence form, which we have downloadable from the site. I think we're going to show you one. And then we also, we'll show you that in the creditable service training. However, there's a form you can download from outside, as well as when you're putting in your member events, you'll actually see that there's a medical version for the leave of absence. We also have one that's for greater than a year medical. So if you're having a hard time reaching that, please, just let us know. We'll happily walk you through the difference. The event structure is exactly the same. You're just noting the specificity for it. We do not need you to provide us the diagnosis or the paperwork. You as the employer are confirming that it is a medical related. If for some reason something seems off, we certainly reserve the right to request proof from the employee that there was some sort of medical leave. But again, there aren't all that many of these overall. If it's less than a year, the distinction is not going to be as important because it's really the year mark that it becomes important. And also, if you have a situation where something's medical and it's regular workers' compensation trumps it because the way that the service credit works. So make sure that if it's medical and it's workers' comp, you're going with the workers' comp version of that. And for more specifics on that, again, our creditable service training that's coming up, we will go through that in depth. Any questions? If there is any portion of time that the person is unpaid, then you'd have to do an unpaid leave form. If the person is 100% paid for the entirety of their leave, you don't have to report anything. If you're paying them 100% and there's no change in their salary, there's no possible creditable service event, and therefore we're not requiring additional paperwork. Good. Okay, awesome. So we talked about Section F, we talked about the 2 exceptions. And then last, of course, everyone's favorite reason for severing membership is retirement, the place we hope we all get to. So if someone declares retirement, that is also a severing of membership. Now, when we were talking before we got into the membership eligibility regulation and how that works, we were talking about some positions and how some people are eligible by title. These are this list of positions we have is something that happens a little less often, and just a few things we wanted to mention because they kind of have tricky rules, right? So one is if you have a coach only member. So coaching is eligible as regular compensation under the statute. We'll get into that in the regular compensation training more specifically. However, you could have a situation where you have somebody who's only a coach for you, and they're like, look, I know I work in this town, but I'm a teacher through the town of Westwood, right? Okay, great. So you are required by law to take MTRS deductions from that coach. Now, I personally, if I was running payroll in a school district and I'm paying coaches that are outside of my district, I would make them all sign a form saying whether or not they are or not an MTRS member elsewhere, right? But that's up to you and how you pay your employees. So if they are concurrently a member at another through another school district of the MTRS, then yes, you are required by the law to take deductions on them. So that will be important. And you need to register them just so that the system will allow you to pay report them. We also have some specific reporting criteria for coaches that we're going to go through in the deduction reporting training. Now, full-time union reps, I mentioned this before. Section 28K has a grouping. A couple of the really larger school districts have some full-time folks that are still contributing to the MTRS. They're working full-time for the school, but they're also just a full-time union rep. And they are eligible right in accordance with the statute. Now, another one that sometimes comes up is that and I'm not sure if we're still doing this post-COVID, but the Commonwealth had 2 different programs. One, I believe, with exchange teachers from China and one with exchange teachers from Spain. And we would sometimes get questions on whether or not those teachers are required to be in the MTRS. After all, they've got a DESE waiver, they're working full-time, and they're working for the school department as a classroom teacher, right? And so they are required to contribute to the MTRS, even though they may have foreign nationality with a different country. They might not be staying at the MTRS long, or in the United States long enough, or they may not think they're going to stay at the United States long enough to acquire a benefit. There is no exception in the statute, so they are required to belong to the MTRS. Sort of a funny anecdote to this is the first case that I ever researched was a Spanish teacher whose name I will not mention. However, she ended up falling in love with an American teacher. She's now a U.S. citizen and she's now a retiree. So this isn't all as bad as it looks. At least the first case I ever had, she is now one of our retirees. So, but there is no exception in the law. So foreign exchange teachers, if that program is still going on, if it starts again or whatever, please know that there's no exception. They do have to belong to the MTRS. And then last, occupational and physical therapists. So occupational and physical therapists are eligible for the MTRS, and in place of DESE licensure, we're going to require allied health professional licensure. This is the only position we will accept AHP licensure for. We're grandfathering this based on a decision by the MTRS back in the 1990s, and this is the one position we will allow for. You cannot use AHP licensure for BCBAs. You cannot use it for any other position, speech therapists or in nurses, but it can be used for occupational and physical therapists specifically. It also does not apply to OTAs or PTAs because it's a different licensure, so it doesn't fit under the grandfathering, and they're different positions altogether. So hopefully that helps. But again, other positions we wanted to make sure that we just kind of talked about a little bit because they're sort of on the fringe. Yes.
Number qualified. District have to report this to MTRS.
Yes. So if a person is being terminated because of conviction, there are some very specific legal requirements that you have to meet. Please watch last week's video. I actually have a section on it. And it tells you, it cites the law and exactly how you're supposed to notify us. You should also notify us even if they're just being investigated. So again, that's a section of last week's presentation. You can find it on our website. Please download that to go through the section. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the dwindled part-time and temporary provision for 6-month wait. So I say it's dwindled a little bit because short-term employment has been eliminated based on the regulation. So really, there's kind of a small window where people might fall into a 6-month wait. And that's really if they're part-time. And so if you have somebody who's joining the MTRS for the first time, they are part-time. Or they're temporary. Now, MTRS is not going to require or not going to consider somebody temporary if they're hired either if they're full-time, pardon me, and they're hired for greater than 6 months, right? And if they're less than 6 months, they're going to be short-term employment. So they're not going to be MTRS eligible at all. Even if you consider them temporary, well, we're bringing them on for 1 year and we're trying them out. That's great. If you're hiring them for longer than 6 months, we don't consider that temporary, so this doesn't apply to them. However, part-time folks, in accordance with the statute, are required to be on a 6-month wait. So if you're hiring somebody, it's their first MTRS membership, they are required to wait 6 months before they contribute. Now, if that member has prior MTRS membership, if they have funds on account with the local board, so you're hiring them for the first time as a half-time teacher, but you know that they were a teacher's aide, maybe they were your teacher's aide, then this 6-month wait may also be waived. So it applies to a very small segment of the population. A very small segment is part-time at all. And so hopefully you won't have too many folks that run into this. If you have questions on a situation and you're not 100% sure if it's eligible, please just reach out to us. We'll walk you through it. Now, keep in mind, though, that some temporary employees will no longer be eligible because it's considered short-term employment. Okay.
Back. They returned as more of a long-term sub. They're filling in for other teachers. Clear ends, and then they'll return to their normal. That term when they come back is less than 6 months. That term sub type of position that we consider short term, back to their action.
Okay, I'm going to try and repeat all that just to make sure everybody could hear it. So there was a question in the queue. And so basically the scenario being proposed is that somebody's on sabbatical, probably for a year. They come back early, but their position has been filled by somebody else. So that position's not available. So now they're going to fill in as a long-term sub. I'm going to presume the person's regularly employed for this long-term sub, right? If they're not, then this answer changes, right? And go back to the previous slides, they would be out if they're not regularly employed. However, oh, they came back full-time. Okay, so they're full-time, so they're regularly employed, but now they're filling what would be short-term employment. And I'm going to say it's not short-term employment based on a very important fact. They are a full-time employee right after this. They get their position back, right? Because they were on sabbatical. So they're not really a short-term employment. Yeah, they're filling this job short-term. They might be in classroom 7 for a little while, but there's already an expectation and a known expectation that they're going to be in classroom 17 later, right? So they're not really employed short-term. So in this very unusual circumstance, I would say short-term employment does not apply because they absolutely are not employed on a short-term basis. As soon as that position is ending, they're immediately getting their classroom back because the sabbatical's over, or the planned time frame around that sabbatical was over. Therefore, it wouldn't apply. Hopefully that's helpful. One other question? Okay.
PTs and OTs. Question is, if it's a new hire OT, PT, are they an MTRS or is that only for those who were grandfathered in?
If it's a new hire PT and OT, if they have their AHP licensure and meet all the other criteria, they are absolutely eligible. So we're grandfathering in the position, but we're folks hired in this position are still covered. All right, awesome. Very good. So the next slide really ties right into that, right? Long-term subs again. So long-term subs, there's no sort of goal to exclude long-term subs, right? It's being a substitute, it just needs to meet the other criteria. There were a lot of situations where somebody was like, oh, well, geez, they're MTRS eligible for like 4 days, and then they're going to go back to being a teacher's aide. Okay, that's short-term employment. That's kind of what we were trying to take off of the burden off of the shoulders of the schools a little bit. You have somebody and they're going to be a teacher for like 85 minutes, and then they're going to go back to being a teacher's aide. Okay, they didn't qualify for MTRS in that tiny little bubble. Okay, but long-term subs themselves, if they meet the 4 eligibility criteria and they're going to be longer than 6 months by appointment, yeah, they're eligible. So if you have somebody and you're hiring them for a year, you're requiring them to have a DESI license, they have their DESI license or they have a waiver, and the fact that they're, sometimes we'll get these questions, well, they're not on the union contract. There is no eligibility criteria here that mentions being on the collective bargaining agreement. There's nothing against being in the union, of course, but there's absolutely nothing that ties the union to MTRS membership or anything like that. So the positions don't have to be in CBAs. They can be. Most of our members, of course, are union members. And again, we have there are multiple unions out there. They're all great. It has nothing to do with excluding them either, but it's not a requirement. So you really should separate those two concepts. Okay. Now, for the long-term subs, if you really apply what we've already talked about, are they regularly employed? Do you require licensure? Do they have sub-licensure? Do they have a waiver instead? Okay, great. Emergency licensure, good. So all of that still applies to them, just like it would your brand new first grade teacher. All right, so I think that's what we have. So that's everything about that particular sort of grouping and how you would apply to the biggest pool of your employees. I just want to give a second in case there are any other questions on that. I think we're good. All right. So now we're going to talk about something else that really is about hiring, right? And that's bringing in some retirees. So you might have somebody who's, retired, you're trying to fill a special need, something like that. And so now you're hiring a retiree to fill that need, right? So first, the restrictions around them were reinstated in 2023. There were a couple of years during the pandemic. It was all hands on deck to try and get kids taught. So those restrictions were lifted for a little while. Now, the restrictions are service cannot exceed 1,200 hours in a calendar year. And I know a calendar year, you're saying to yourself, we're schools, we don't do calendar years. The statute's written for all public employees, so it's based on calendar year. For a school, it's kind of nice because you can divide up 2 calendar years for 1 school year. So, sometimes that works to your benefit. Now, the earnings cannot exceed the difference between what they would have made had they not retired and what they get as a pension. So if they would have made $100,000 as whatever position they're working in, and then they're retired and they're getting a benefit of $60,000, you've got a $40,000 window to work with. Now, in addition to that, if the person has been retired for a full January to December period, very specifically January to December, not 12 calendar months. They have to be all 12 calendar months in the same calendar year. The legislature wrote this, not me. So if they have been retired for a full January to December calendar year, they get $15,000 added to that pool. So instead of $40,000 in my example, it would be $55,000. Now, if a member is planning to retire and then return to the same employer that they're retiring from, they have to be separated for 60 days before they can do so. There are 2 exceptions to that. If the person is 62 or older, or if they're at a maximum 80% option A benefit. So if they maxed out their pension, they can come back to work the next Monday. And again, they'll still be under restrictions, but there's no federal separation of service required. If the person's going to a different district, it's changing employers, and again, it's not a problem. or if the person, again, is 62 or has the max benefit. I forget which one I had said in the first one, sorry. But those two criteria waive that, and that's a federal requirement, not an MTRS requirement. Now, retirees also have some other options. So let's say they're retired, they get an option, they want to do like 1 year, they get an offer they can't refuse, but it's going to be more than their limits. And they're like, oh, but I'd really like to do this opportunity. Retirees can place their benefit on hold. And if their benefit is on hold, they're not double dipping. So it's perfectly legal for them to work in the public sector and continue to do so. Once they leave that employment, they can turn their benefit back on and everybody's happy. We do ask this, ask that they give us a little bit of notice so that we can get it turned on in time for them. They do have to leave the employment situation before they're qualified to turn that back on. And if you have any retirees that are looking to do this, they should really kind of go through our site and make sure that they're well aware of the situation. If you're bringing back a retiree, there are no retirement deductions that are required. They're not required to pay us. They're not required to pay the local board. They're not required to pay Social Security. They are not required to do mandatory OBRA. They are retired. They are a retired annuitant, and therefore they're not required to make those contributions. They can electionarily or electively participate in your like 403B program, or if you have a 457 or smart plan, they can choose to do that if they want to from wages, but they are not required to pay anything as a retiree. Now, this is going to be a little bit different as a retiree, but you can have some situations where someone decides to reinstate their service. Maybe they retired really young and they're not really getting a great benefit. Probably, the cases that I've seen, and I think there are fewer than 20 ever. But it tends to be like somebody was moving out of state. They thought somewhere else was going to be awesome. And then they come back and they're like, yeah, I don't want to live in that place. And so they might find it advantageous to unretire. That process is incredibly expensive and they have to reinstate for 5 years full time. So there are a lot of restrictions that make that very uncommon. But it can happen, and it's important for you to know that it's a possibility and that there's an entire process that they have to work out before they can do so. And then something else for retirees. Take this as information for yourselves too, because all these rules apply to us as public employees, right? So if you're retiring, there's no restrictions on working in the private sector. There are no restrictions on working out of state, so they can work in public in New Hampshire or Rhode Island or something. Or if they work for the federal government, okay? They can't work in a capacity where they're serving one of those three, but they're in a district. So if the federal government creates something where they have somebody who's going to go in and manage grants for a school district, or they're working for some private entity, but they're really reporting to the school district. If you get cute with that, it's going to, they could run into a situation where they are violating the earnings restriction. So it's very important to make sure that they are distinctly separate from the public. Yes.
What if a retiree from another district comes on as a sub and works a lot, but does not disclose they're retired from the MTRS from another district?
Okay. So you have someone who's come in and they're a sub and they've not disclosed the fact that they're a retiree. Well, I guess I'd question who looked at their resume. Because if you're hiring them, I'd presume you probably went through a resume and you should have seen that they're a classroom teacher. So that in theory, you should kind of be able to smoke that out and figure out that they're a retiree from somewhere. So what I would say is that sounds like a bad onboarding process and that part needs to be improved. But if that's a situation, then it would be important for us to go back and look and see if there was an unrealized violation of benefits. If this happened prior to 2023 in one of the 2 pandemic years, then you might be good to go. But it's important that we make sure that gets disclosed as quickly as we can, and then hopefully you got lucky and they just stayed under their earnings limits. Technically, as the employer, you're required to take back whatever you overpaid them, and you're on the hook for that. So, in violations, that can be pretty serious. So, and it can become a problem for your superintendent. So, it'd be important to try and track that down as quickly as possible.
2 more.
Okay.
Is working for the district as instructional assistant and then is appointed to a full year teacher long-term sub. Can they choose to remain in the local retirement board and contribute to MTRS?
Okay, so question, this kind of goes back to some of the previous slides where we were talking about eligibility and transferring in. So you're in a situation where somebody's being appointed to a full-time teaching job, but they were a teacher's aide. And so the question would be, in that so there are long-term sub, and it's going to be for a full year. So, okay, it's not temporary because it's a full year. Long-term sub position. My question would be, are they required to have a license? Right? So full-time teaching gig, I'm guessing they really do, right? And so did they get an emergency license? Because how did you legally clear paying a teacher's aide to be a teacher? And so my thought would be you've probably gotten an emergency license or a waiver. So if you've done that, then they meet the 4 eligibility criteria and they're legally required to join the MTRS. If one of those things aren't true, like you didn't go get a license or you're not requiring them to have a waiver, I think you have bigger problems with DESE with hiring somebody who's not qualified to be a teacher. So again, our structure is really set up that you're following DESE's requirements. So it sounds like they would be required to be eligible for that year. It's hard to say sort of blanketly, but I think we're good with that. Okay.
Life expired and they went to a long-term sub.
So the question is, what if somebody is a full-time teacher, their license expires, so they're no longer qualified to be a teacher, and therefore you're giving them a long-term sub job that doesn't require them to have a license while they're maybe getting renewed or something. So I think that answers itself a little bit, right? So they're not qualified to be a teacher, which is why they're getting bumped down to a long-term sub. They're not qualified for the MTRS anymore, because if they were, you probably wouldn't push them down to being a long-term sub, right? It's important they keep up their licensure. So my guess is that by long-term sub, you're now putting them in a position that doesn't require licensure. That's what you had to do because the teacher license expired, and that's what's going to kick them out of MTRS. They're not working as a teacher, not legally, not as a licensed teacher, because that's the whole point of why they had to get kicked to a different position. So hopefully that helps. Okay, back to the retirees. We're going to go. So again, we were talking about there's no restrictions if you're in other sectors. There's a program called a critical shortage waiver. So this is run through DESE. And for critical shortage waivers, school districts can get a waiver on the licensure requirement, on the restrictions for a retiree. So you have to be able to prove to DESE, we have a situation that's an emergency. We went through exhaustive efforts and we can't find somebody who qualifies, right? So DESE grants this critical shortage waiver. And so you really have to go through them to get it granted. Now, there are some restrictions on people who retired under Retirement Plus. They don't qualify to go for a critical shortage waiver for the first 2 years that they're retired. So it's important that you manage all of that, and that's all in the DESE process. But someone working under a critical shortage waiver can work without restrictions. No deductions taken, of course, and that critical shortage waiver has to be renewed each year by DESE. A good example of this is that there was a superintendent who tragically died at a very young age, and their old superintendent was able to step in and take over as superintendent. And so that would obviously be a perfect situation for a critical shortage waiver. And then last but not least, employers should always, if you're hiring retirees, fill out the online retiree calculator. Okay, that will protect you because there's a section where you have your retirees sign off on the fact that they understand the rules and that you've gone through it with them and they know what their limits are. Okay, so I'm just seeing the time. I'm not keeping up a good pace on this. I apologize. We will step through the next few sections and try to make this as quick as we possibly can. So now that we have an idea of who's eligible, we talked about retiring people, we talked about the membership reg and eligibility. So now registration. So registration is required by law, right? So you have somebody who's an eligible teacher, you have to put them in MTRS. This should be part of your onboarding process with your human resources department. They're onboarding your employees, they should set them up in the retirement system. You also want to make sure that you're setting them up properly in your payroll system. Super important to have good deduction reports and reporting going on. Somebody's getting onboarded, or even if they're switching employment. So you have a brand new person, so you can set them up. But don't forget, when you have your existing people, paras, your teachers' aides, that sort of thing, make sure that they're going to get set up in the system. They get set up in MTRS for reporting purposes, but also fixed in your payroll system to make sure that the right deductions are going to come out at the right time. When they're onboarding, there's also a form called the SSA 1945. This is a form required by the Social Security Administration because folks are not going to be in the Social Security benefit. And so you have to make sure you're disclosing that to them. Now, we get some of these and they're filled out sort of I think without a little bit of common sense here. So you're sending this to the MTRS, right? So we have your employee name, that's great. Employee ID. If you give us their employee ID number, as in with your school district, you may as well write down a word that's not even in English. We don't have your employee ID system number. So please either have them put their social security number or their MTRS membership number there so that we can find them. For employer name, please make sure you list your district in eligible handwriting, okay? And your employer code is your 4-digit MTRS ID number, okay? So with those things, we should be good. We'll have this on file for you. You send a copy to the MTRS, we file them in the person's image. Later on, if they try to claim that you didn't disclaim this to them, we will have a copy for you and we can protect you with it. If you're not filling these out right and we can't figure out who they belong to, we're not going to be able to do that for you. And you're required to do this by federal law. This is not an MTRS rule. This is a Social Security thing because you're excluding them from Social Security benefits. So it's very important that you have this disclosure filled out when you're onboarding people. So now we're going to talk about MTRS registration. And again, I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. I apologize for not being more mindful of the clock. So registering an MTRS, you can see there's a whole list of information that is very important to make sure you have. SSNs, licensure information. The licensure information is going to be pretty critical as we just went through. That's what makes them eligible, right? So when you're if you sign into our MTRS system, you're going to see that right from the homepage that there's a link that says register an employee. All right, this is exactly where it's located. And then the wizard's going to come up. And you're going to see, as I tried to add a couple of arrows in here to show you that it's a step-by-step process, you're going to start by putting in their SSN and hitting next. In the next screen, in the top section, if they came back as a matching MTRS member, so you're setting up Sally and Sally already belongs to the MTRS, it's going to pre-fill with Sally's information. If not, you're going to get the message that I show on the screen here that there's no matching SSN. So of course, you're going to have to give us some information. So we put in, my example for this slide is Melita. So Melita Music is a brand new teacher. You list her date of birth, you list her info, and then you go on to the next step. And as you can see, for each one of these steps, I'm highlighting what step we're on in the actual wizard. So for this step, you're going to put in her phone number and email, right? Probably not a whole lot to say about those. So the next step, this is where you're going to give us pertinent employment information. So you're going to go right down this list where I have all the arrows. You're going to tell us when she started, what her position is. Do you require, is she temporary or not? Is she full-time, half-time? We try to give you a little blurb to make sure you're giving us her full year, full-time salary, even if you're hiring her in the middle of the year or if she's part-time. You're going to tell us when you're first taking deductions for her, so our system can anticipate her first deduction. And then you're going to give us her contract info, right? She's a 10-month employee, 26 pays, lump sum, or maybe she's being paid over 12 months. So again, pretty standard stuff. When you hit next, this screen's going to come up and you'll see that I have two chunks at the top. And so this screen's conditional. At the top, if you say the person's not required to be licensed, you're not going to get questions on their licensure, right? That kind of makes sense. Why would we ask you about licensure if you just told us you're not requiring it? So if you say yes, you're going to get more questions. Now, if you say yes, they're required to be licensed, you're going to get a teacher certification status, right? Yeah, we require it, but they're not certified. What? So, like we're going to ask you some questions there. Depending on the answer you give us there, we may or may not give you fields to put in their certification information. I cannot say enough. If you have somebody who has an emergency license or a waiver, do not pick not certified. Not certified means nope. They have no connection to DESE at all. We just hired somebody off the street. If they have a waiver, please make sure you pick waiver. We end up chasing down all kinds of eligibility stuff because somebody picked the wrong option. Please read all 4 options, okay? So if somebody is here and yes, they received a waiver from DESE, great. So you should have received a waiver as their eligibility criteria.
A question on the SSA form. I've never been asked to send these to the MTRS. We have them on file, but I've never sent them. What should I do?
I would say for now, start sending them. And again, please make sure you're putting their SSNs or MTRS member numbers on them. If you'd like to send us the old ones, you can. Just keep in mind, if you haven't been sending them, if we got audited or if there's a case where a member's claiming that they weren't notified, we're not going to be able to protect you in that situation. And it's not an MTRS requirement. It's a federal requirement that you send it to the retirement board. It literally says it on the form. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so back into the enrollment. If you click Next, this is going to be a summary of all the information you entered, right? Excuse me, that you entered. So I'm not really going to go through this too deeply. Basically, make sure everything you put in there is right. This is a great spot because you can go back if you realize you made a mistake. So please take a moment and go through everything you entered and make sure it's right. Now, this is so I'm presuming you hit next and now you've enrolled the person, right? So it's all in the system, but this is only half the job, right? So now on the top section, you can go and create an enrollment sheet for your records. I'm going to talk about that in just 1 minute, but you might have noticed I've promised the director of enrollments that I was going to very subtly point out the second button on this screen. You'll see it surrounded by arrows, that button. Folks are not hitting this button enough, this is how you actually send the enrollment form to your employees. You hit that, and because you already gave us their email, we are going to email them a link saying, hey, you have to enroll for the MTRS. So please make sure you're hitting the email enrollment sheet button so that your members will, or your brand new employees will enroll for the MTRS. They're required to do that as part of membership. Now, when they do that, I'm going to show you, you get a confirmation message to show you that it went through, okay? Now, if you were to click on the enrollment sheet, you see this is what it looks like. This is one I did yesterday as far as mocking this up. And you'll see that I'm the school district person. I set up Melita and we set her up and we have her start date and stuff. So I would suggest you keep a copy of this for your records. This proves that you met your legal requirements. You set the person up, hopefully during onboarding, well before they started work. DESE might ask you, hey, do you have proof that you register your MTRS members? If you're keeping a copy of these, whether it's electronic or paper in somebody's files, you can say yes, and I can provide you a copy if they give you a sample of people. If you're going through that DESE process and you call us, the point of the DESE process is to make sure you are doing it. So do not ask your employer services rep to start pulling up copies of these to prove you did it. That means you were not doing what you're supposed to be doing and you're not keeping proof that you're following the law. So please do. It doesn't matter if you keep them electronically or if you keep them in people's individual files. How you file them is completely up to you. But just make sure you're keeping the paperwork to prove that you're following the law. Now, when you're clicking, depending on the browser you use, sometimes this throws people off a little bit. When you click on that enrollment sheet, you'll see the top arrow here. I'm just pointing out that sometimes it opens as a different tab as opposed to opening right on the screen. So you might have to click into that second tab. Now, in this case, the person being me, I emailed Melita her enrollment sheet. So you'll see that you get a confirmation message right at the top. Email has been sent to the member. So that tells you, yes, I have done what I'm supposed to do. Also, maybe not the worst thing to keep a copy of to prove that you sent the email out to your member. Like if the superintendent comes asking why people aren't enrolling, you can prove that you're doing the right thing and you're sending the emails out to them. Now, once you do, it's going to create this email. So this is being sent out to Melita, and it explains to her to go to our website. She needs to click on enroll. I'm going to show you very quickly what those screens look like as well. We won't go through every single step for the member screen, but I just want to give you an idea of what, the experience they go through. Now, once you've done this, you've registered an employee, you've sent it out to them. Now they have everything they need. Well, let's talk about member enrollment. So members are required by law, the regulation CMR 4.03. They're also required by Chapter 32 to petition for membership. And so that's what we're doing here. We're trying to meet that requirement. And so, think of this as like a bank application. If they were opening a bank account, they wouldn't, you have to fill out paperwork. Yeah, we have to make sure we have certain information on you so we can contact you, prove you're you and prove you're eligible. So they can do their materials completely online. I've seen members do it in like 3 minutes while they have me on the phone. It really doesn't take all that long. A lot of the information is pre-filled by you or by their previous enrollment. So especially people who are changing school districts, God, this is such an easy process as long as they can get in. So, we like to point out to them, look, if you haven't enrolled and you apply for a benefit, we're going to send you back your application and say, hey, go enroll online. You were supposed to do this years ago. We're also going to be escalating. We already have these batches of contacts we send out to emails, batches of emails that we send out to members trying to get them to do the process. So we're going to harass them a little bit there. It is always helpful that their employer tells them that it's not spam, that there's an expectation that they need to enroll, and they're going to be reported to the superintendent. So, it's really important that folks go through this process. And I just want to note that it's important that folks know that they have to do this every time they change employers. So they might be like, oh, I'm already an MTRS member. Great. You just have to repetition again as your new member through your new job, pardon me.
Is there a way to request that the email be sent to the employee to enroll, or is it a one-time thing?
So as of this moment in the system, you cannot re-trigger the email. We are working on a possible solution for that. So we are working to possibly see if we can create a mechanism in ESS where you'd be able to resend it. What I would say is if you kept a copy of the online confirmation, you can always do it that way. If you wanted, you could put together an email, you have a copy of what we say to them, you can always print your own. There's an enrollment report that you can pull from MTRS that'll show you everybody who hasn't enrolled. So you can use that if you'd like. One of the other things is I'm going to show you a picture of oh no, I don't show you the roster. In the roster function in MTRS, whenever you add an employee, they default to the top. So your newest employees will always, if you click in roster, your newest employees will always be the top people listed. And so you can see what their enrollment status is through the roster as well. So there's a couple of different ways that you can access it if you want to follow up with people. So that way you can see whether or not they've enrolled. We are working on one. We have a project that's going to be in between. So I'm pushing hard. I don't want to make any empty promises, but I'm hoping we'll have that capability for you by next summer. Now, once a member has been sent this and they go in, let's say they're creating their account, we're going to show you what that screen looks like in just a second. The enrollment process is automatically available to them. So they sign in and they create the username and password and they're like, cool, let me go check out my MTRS account. As soon as they do, it's going to pop them right into the enrollment wizard. So it doesn't even give them the option anymore of like not doing that part. Because we did have a problem for a while where members were acting in good faith. They were creating username and passwords, but then they weren't enrolling. So it automatically opens up into that wizard so that they get that part done before they can do the other features in MSS. And then some of the things we collect during enrollment, it's pretty straightforward stuff. Certain demographic info, we confirm their license, their address, and that sort of stuff. Now, when we send the member to an email and it has a link, and this is just the page that brings them to, and you can see that they can sign in if they're already an MTRS member, or they can create an account if they're not. And so we have some general information sort of explaining the process and some instructions below. So all that's made available to the members. And if they click on create an account or sign in, they get the same screen. So you'll see this looks very much like the screen that some of you use to access MTRS. Sometimes you guys end up on this one by accident because you're trying to go in as an employer and you Google us. We have more members than employers, so it will probably bring you to this screen. Now, remember, let's say they create their access, they choose to create down below there, or they're signing with their username and password. Now, if they need to enroll, it will automatically pop them into this wizard. Now, I have arrows over all the steps just to show that it's a wizard. You've completed it's a lot like the registration wizard you complete. They go through each step. We ask them for information. They put in their name, they put in their SSN and their date of birth as their verification key. And then here, you'll see that on step 1, they're going to scroll through a bunch of information. They're going to confirm, yeah, I'm really Melita. I have X amount of dependent children. I'm a veteran, et cetera, et cetera. I did not go through step by step on this just because, I want to give you an overview. Now, when they're done, they can create an enrollment confirmation form. You can feel free to create a policy where they're required to give you a copy of this. That proves that they have done their portion of the job. Now, they can email this to you. They can save it as a PDF. They can print it out on paper, however you decide you want to collect it. Another little known secret, I think, is that if they're like, oh, geez, when that came up, I didn't know to print it. Sorry, I can't get to it. That is not true. They can take their newly created username and password, sign into MTRS, and they can access that document in the documents link anytime they'd like to. So if you want to require that they give you this, say, in order to be set up for direct deposit or something, you could do that kind of a thing, and they can always get to the document as long as they've really enrolled. Now, they will also get an email from us. Now, this email has their username. So having you requiring them to send you the email probably doesn't make a lot of sense because now you've got their username. That's a little icky. You don't want to do that. But they do get an email from us that confirms to them that they have a username in MTRS as part of the setup process. So we just wanted to share that so you just have an idea of kind of how the process generally works. Now, once a person has been set up, once you've registered them, you might be thinking to yourself, well, all right, well, now I got to get them in payroll, right? I need to figure out what their rate is. Well, if you go into MTRS and you click on the registration, the employee roster, you can look up an individual and you can find several things. You can find, obviously we have what we have listed as their name, their MTRS membership number is here. So that can be great if you're sending an email to us and you don't want to send SSN, of course. But and this is where you would enter in employment events, which we cover in a different training. But at the bottom, it tells you what that member's contribution rate is. So you have a brand new employee, they're joining you and you're like, oh man, I'm not sure what rate I should be taking. Yes, you do. As soon as you've registered them, this is available to you. You can look up the member and you can put their proper contribution rate into your payroll system. Really, there's no good reason not to be doing this during the onboarding process. Now, I've heard occasionally that, well, I mean, we're trying to get them up for payroll and, we need to get them set up. Well, okay, we'll have HR register them. That information becomes available to you the moment they register them, even before the member has done their enrollment. So again, there's not a good reason not to pull this information straight out of MTRS. Now, just as a general topic, we do have members with different contribution rates, and this is how those rates were derived into the statute. So the rates are based on two factors. When they first join the MTRS and sort of their continual membership, whether they've been in 6 employers or just one, or even if they were a teacher's aide, then they roll over and transfer to us, those rights transfer with them. And so the original retirement date, their card membership goes back to a certain date, and that date is going to determine what their contribution rate is. Now, the other factor is retirement plus, right? So it's the combination of those two things. When they got here, did they elect? Did they have an election? That's going to be important. Again, we're going to state exactly what their rate is, but this is really the nuts and bolts of how it works based on. Now, if you go way down the bottom, you can see the folks who joined before 1975 were 5% members. I kid you not, I was looking at a report this week and we still have some 5% members. That means they have been a member for like 40 something years. It is incredible, but they are still working in a school district and they are a 5% member. So we keep it on the chart because they're actually still there. Okay, so when you have somebody who's brand new and they're joining MTRS, they have no prior service, easy peasy, they're going to 11% member, right? For folks who already have some membership somewhere, so let's say they're joining the MTRS, but before they were joining the MTRS, they were a public librarian for a town, or they were a teacher's aide, which is probably the most common, or they were a psychologist in a prison. That's an actual one. So in that case, they might be transferring in service and service rights, okay? And so Retirement Plus can get a little complicated for those folks because there's a couple of different scenarios. So folks who establish their rate at a local retirement board are entitled to transfer that to the MTRS, but it kind of depends on when they start. Okay, so for a long time, this is exactly how it worked. They were a para first, so they were 9+2. They become a teacher. Now they have the right to say, well, I still want to have my 9+2, right? So there were a lot of folks that were given an election when they first joined the MTRS. And so Retire Plus is an enhancement that only applies to MTRS members, and it gives them a boost to their pension calculation depending on if they're tier 1 or tier 2 at 30 years or might be 32 years. And it allows them to get to 80% faster is kind of the easier way of saying that, right? And so it was established in July 1st, 2001. Wow, I can't believe it's been that long. And that was the year I started. So, and if they had everybody who was in the system in 2001 got an election. Everyone who joined afterwards, they only got an election if they had service transferring in, right? Anyone who's brand new, they started in 2008, they never had any public service, they were mandated into Retirement Plus, and all that part was pretty easy. But people transferring in becomes complicated, and in schools, we have a lot of transfers. We probably transfer 1,500 people a year, probably up to 2,000 at this point. So if they were given their one-time election and they didn't fill out anything, the law defaulted them out because they thought they were protecting people. Right. So there was a lot of court cases, a lot of people who swear to God they didn't get a form, even some of them that did complete a form and said no. They were all saying, look, I never got a form, like, so it was a bit of a mess for us. And that's why for the longest time, we were telling you, if you have an existing member, even if their rate looks different than MTRS, don't touch it. We might be in court with them. But, and so we petitioned the legislature, we pushed really hard. And in 2002, we got a law change. So in 2002, 2022, we got a law change. So in the acts of 2022, they created two things. One, all the people going all the way back to 2001 who were in a limbo status all got another chance to say yes. Okay. For some of them, they did. For some of them, they did not. But we mailed the heck out of them to try and give them a form. Okay. So everyone who starts, and that election period, I'm sorry, was between January 1st, 2023 and June of 2023. Dave Percoco, we have some videos that are available up on our site. He covers it in great depth. He did a great job at those, did a great job managing the process. And we're still in the process of calculating people from that. So for folks that are in that boat, the law really looked to take care of those folks, because there definitely was some confusion in the structure and the way that works, okay? And so we're still sorting out. There's a lot of folks that are involved. There was thousands of people. So we're in the still in the process of sorting out some of those results. And of course, with employer reporting backed up as it is right now, that's complicated a step further, but we're doing everything we can to catch that up, of course, with you guys. So all the help you can give us with that would be really appreciated. Now, it also changed the way elections work going forward. Okay, so going forward, if a person joins the MTRS after July 1st of 2022, now if they had no service to transfer in, nothing's really changed for them at all. They're an 11% member, they're mandated, they're good to go. If they have transferring in service, the question's going to be, that transferring in service established before July 1st, 2022 or after July 1st, 2022. So if it's after July 1st, 2022, again, mandatory, no questions. If they have service that predates the change to the law, they're going to be grandfathered in. So they're going to get an election where we're going to say, okay, you started in December of 2022, you worked as a teacher's aide for a couple of years. We're going to have you now. The way that the way that the Retirement Plus law now works is reversed. So if you do not tell us otherwise, we're going to include you in Retirement Plus. So you have to tell us you don't want in, or else you're going to get pushed in. And hopefully this will lead to far fewer people being upset, far fewer mistakes. But people who do have service that grandfathers in before the new law was in place get the opportunity to elect out if they'd like. So these. And most importantly for that, because I know I kind of covered it high level, is we have some resources available. So if somebody's in this boat, if you have somebody in this boat, or you just want to have a better understanding for it, we have a Retirement Plus Resource Center. We also have the employer webinars that are up in our external website. David goes through I think there are 3 total. And he just does a tremendous job, very specifically addressing how this election process worked, what the expectations are, how it's going to work as far as calculating people. So he covers that very much in depth, and I didn't want to duplicate any of that effort. And frankly, he probably did it better than I ever could. So please know that information's there. If you have a hard time finding it or something, please let us know, and we'll make sure you can get to it. And then, last but not least, you're a key partner to what we do. Please know, we need your help with determining eligibility, tracking enrollment, doing your deduction reporting, regular comp. So I'm hoping these training sessions will be a big step forward for everybody and their knowledge base, and helping getting everybody on the same page. And then last but not least, if you find yourself in a situation like the young lady in this slide, please reach out for help. Okay, so we have the Contact Employer Services page that's available. Most of you, I'm sure, know who your assigned employer services representative is. If it's regarding retiree insurance, I know we didn't cover that at all today, but please remember, please know to reach out to the insurance updates email address. But if it's anything regarding active employment, you have every single school district has an assigned employer services representative. If you're not sure who it is, you can certainly see here we have a main address you can reach out to, which is EMP sup@trb.state.ma.us. It's on the screen as well. And that's just short for employer support. And so we always have somebody monitoring that box. So for some reason, if your rep is on vacation, or if you're just, you're new to your employer and you don't know who your rep is, we can always get you connected. So hopefully you found this helpful. I'm sorry I went over, but we went through a ton of stuff and hopefully answered some questions. So please reach out if you need anything. And I'm just going to ask if we have any pending questions at this point.
There's one last pending question in the chat. It was from a while ago, but it says, I have an employee who was an EA last year and will be a 0.6 teacher and 0.2 EA for this year. Will they only have MTRS deducted, or will they have deductions to the MTRS for the 0.6 position and the local retirement for the 0.2 position?
Okay, so the question is, so it sounds like they were a member of the local retirement board and now they're in a hybrid position, and that hybrid position is at least a 0.6, and now they have a 0.2 for being the EA, which I believe is probably an ed assistant, and that would be with the local board. So really, under Stone v. Crab, they should remain with the local board for the 0.2 and join the MTRS. So they do join the MTRS as a 0.6. They have prior membership. They are not subject to the 6-month wait. Now, I'm going to presume that they're not in a short-term employment situation. They're not a disqualified long-term sub, right? So they have to be in a position that's required to have a license. They've got the license, or they've got a waiver. They're going to be there for 6 months or longer. So this isn't a temporary situation. But in that case, you would enroll them in the MTRS because they had the prior membership. 6-month wait does not apply to them. And they should remain local for the 0.2, even if the local board has a 20-hour requirement. They are not severing employment. So therefore, they should remain at the local board for the 0.2 and be a teacher for the 0.6. And I know that's utterly complicated. All I can say is, unfortunately, when employers present complicated situations, we have complicated, solutions. So hopefully that helps. All right, I'm going to give it like another 5 seconds. Let's make sure no other questions come in. Think we're good. So thanks again. I'm sorry we went over a little bit. I'll try to be better about that. And then on behalf of the board and then the executive director, thanks for joining us. I hope everybody has a great Wednesday.